Before I tell you my name, you must understand what it is to be erased. Not to die, but to be rendered so insignificant that your presence leaves no ripple in the air, no echo in the stone halls you walk. For 12 years, that was my purpose. I was a ghost in the holiest place on earth, a maid within the gilded cage of Vatican City. My name is Elena, and my job was to make things disappear. A fingerprint on a cardinal's desk, a speck of dust on a 16th-century fresco, the lingering scent of cigar smoke in a chamber where history was being rewritten. But in the Vatican, you quickly learn that dust is not the only thing they want erased. Memory is the real enemy, and silence is the weapon they use to kill it. From the moment I first walked through the Leonine Wall, I felt the weight of it. This wasn't the reverent hush of a cathedral. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of quiet, a pressure that pushed down on your soul. The rules were never written down, but they were in the very air you breathed. You learned them in the sharp, averted glances of the senior staff if you met their eyes for a second too long, in the way a priest's conversation would instantly dissolve into prayer if you rounded a corner too quickly, in the metallic finality of a heavy door locking somewhere in the labyrinthine corridors. The silence was a living thing, a guard dog that patrolled every hallway, and its bite was fear. The first time it was given a voice was by Signora Vettori, the head of the domestic staff, a woman whose face was a mask of pious severity, all sharp angles and unforgiving lines. I was new, just a girl from the countryside, still awed by the grandeur. My task was a small, private library, a room not on any official tour, filled with books bound in dark, cracked leather. My eyes had been drawn to a magnificent wall tapestry. It didn't depict saints or scenes from the Bible. It showed strange, winged figures with the heads of animals. A hawk, a crocodile, a jackal, all gathered around a blinding sun. They felt ancient, powerful, and utterly out of place. I must have stared for a moment too long. Elena! Signora Vittori's voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a shard of ice. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. She stood in the doorway, her hands clasped, her eyes holding no warmth. Your job is to clean what is before you, not to understand it, she said, her words perfectly spaced, each one a stone dropped into a deep well. Curiosity is a weed here. We pull it out by the root. She held my gaze until I looked down at the floor, shamed and terrified. I never forgot. From then on, I perfected the art of being invisible. I learned to see without looking, to hear without listening. I became a ghost in the machine, a pair of hands moving through rooms where immense power was wielded. But a ghost still sees. A ghost remembers. And the Vatican is haunted by more than just its past. I learned the subtle language of its secrets. The books turned spine in on a shelf, hiding their forbidden titles. The locked drawers and desks that held nothing of monetary value. The hushed, frantic conversations that would cease the moment my footsteps echoed on the marble floor. I remember the scent that would sometimes leak from beneath a sealed door in the deepest part of the archives. A dry, spicy smell of old papyrus and myrrh, a scent so ancient it felt like a violation in this place of stone and incense. I also remember the fear. Not my fear, but theirs. There were certain days that had nothing to do with the holy calendar, when a nervous energy would grip the entire city. It often coincided with specific astrological alignments, a fact I only pieced together later. On those days, the priests would walk faster, their faces pale, their whispered prayers more fervent, their eyes scanning the sky as if expecting an unwelcome visitor. They were holding something at bay, performing a ritual of containment disguised as prayer. I didn't have the words for it then, but I knew I was living inside a great and terrible secret. A truth so profound that the most powerful institution on earth had dedicated 2 millennia to burying it alive. They thought I was just a maid, a simple, forgettable girl. They thought I was invisible. They were right, but they forgot one crucial thing about being invisible. No one ever sees you watching. And it all began the day a cardinal was called away in a hurry, leaving behind a book that was never, ever meant for my eyes. There are rooms in the Vatican where the air is so heavy with prayer it feels like you're walking underwater. Then there are rooms like Cardinal Albrecht's study. The air in there was heavy too, but not with prayer. It was thick with the weight of secrets, ancient and unforgiving. It smelled of old leather, cloying incense, and something else, a faint metallic tang beneath it all, like a coin held too long in a sweaty palm, or a bloodstain that never quite washed out. For 2 years, cleaning that study was my most dreaded task. Cardinal Albrecht was a man spoken of in whispers, a prince of the church whose intellect was matched only by his ruthlessness. He was on the path to the papacy, and his power was absolute. His study was his sanctuary, his fortress, and my instructions were simple, cold, and final. Dust the surfaces, polish the floors, and never, under penalty of immediate dismissal and disgrace, touch the books on his desk. For 2 years I obeyed. The books were behemoths, bound in black and crimson leather with no titles, only strange, geometric symbols embossed in faded gold that seemed to writhe in the candlelight. I cleaned around them, my cloth never once brushing their ancient covers. I treated his desk like an altar to a god I did not know and did not wish to. But one Tuesday afternoon, the perfect, unyielding rhythm of the Vatican broke. The cardinal was summoned to an unscheduled meeting, something so urgent he left his study in a hurry. And in his haste, he committed an unthinkable sin in his own meticulously controlled world. He left one of the great books open on his desk. I saw it the moment I pushed the heavy oak door open. The sight sent a jolt of ice through my veins. A book, splayed open, its pages exposed to the air like a wound. My training, my fear, screamed at me to back out, to close the door and pretend I had never seen it. But I was frozen. The illustration on the open page held me captive, pulling me forward against my will. It was not a scene from the Gospels. It was not a choir of angels or the serene face of the Madonna. It was a drawing of a man with the sleek, black head of a jackal, his posture one of intense, divine concentration. In his hands he held a magnificent golden scale. On one side of the scale was a human heart, still glistening as if freshly plucked from a chest. On the other was a single, impossibly white feather. His eyes, rendered in stunning, terrifying detail, seemed to look right through me, judging the weight of my own soul. Beside him stood another figure with the curved beak of an ibis, a scribe, noting the result on a scroll of papyrus. The artistry was breathtaking, but the feeling it produced in me was one of absolute, blasphemous horror. I had been taught my whole life that these were the faces of demons, the pagan gods of a fallen world, temptations to lead the faithful into damnation. Yet here they were, in a cardinal's private book, studied with an intensity one could see in the sharp, precise notes scribbled in Italian in the margins. My hands trembled as I dared to lean closer, my shadow falling across the page. I couldn't read the main text. It was a language of birds and eyes and serpents, but the cardinal's notes were a different story. They were a litany of secrets. The voice must be restored before the final rite. The spell predates the Noachian flood by 1,000 years. Their concept of resurrection is physical, not spiritual, a dangerous divergence. And then one line, underlined twice in sharp, angry red ink, a phrase that stopped the blood in my veins. They knew how to speak to the silent gods. The silent gods, plural. A floorboard creaked in the long corridor outside. Panic, pure and undiluted, seized me. My mind screamed. They knew someone was coming. I would be found out. With a clumsy, shaking hand, I reached out and closed the heavy book. The cover fell with a soft, final thump, releasing a puff of ancient air that smelled of desert sand and something dry and sweet, like preserved flowers. I scrambled to align it perfectly with the other books, my breath catching in my throat. I fled the room without finishing my duties, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. That night, sleep was impossible. The image of the jackal-headed god was burned into my mind, the cardinal's notes echoing in the darkness. I finally understood. The deafening silence that permeated the Vatican wasn't empty. It was a container. It was the heavy lid on a sarcophagus, holding back a history they hadn't just defeated, but had stolen, studied, and secretly revered. The fear I now felt wasn't just of losing my job. It was the bone-deep terror of knowing that the holy men I served were not shepherds protecting their flock from a forgotten evil. They were wardens, guarding a power so immense they had to lock it away even from the light of their own God. Every great power has a heart, a place where its secrets are pumped like blood through its veins. In the Vatican, that heart is the secret archives, a subterranean labyrinth where 10 centuries of truth are buried under lock and key. Officially, my duties as a maid never took me into that sacred darkness. But the Vatican is 2 cities. The one the world sees, a glorious facade of faith and stone, and the one hidden behind it, a web of service corridors, forgotten stairwells, and cold, damp passages that run alongside the official places like the dark veins on the back of a leaf. It was in one of these veins, a passage smelling of ozone and wet rock that ran parallel to the main archival corridor, that I heard the conversation that would condemn me. I was carrying a heavy bucket of cleaning supplies, my rubber-soled shoes silent on the stone floor, when I heard the voices. They were low, urgent, and vibrating with a fear so profound it seemed to make the air itself tremble. I froze, pressing myself into a deep alcove where the shadows were thick as ink. I recognized the voices immediately. One belonged to Father Michel, a young, ambitious scholar from France whose ambition was always at war with his nervous disposition. The other was the deep, gravelly rasp of Monsignor Costello, a senior archivist who had been a fixture in the Vatican for 50 years. Costello was a man who looked as though he'd been carved from the same ancient stone as the city itself, and it was said he knew where every document was buried, especially the ones that didn't officially exist. It should never have been found, Father Michel was saying, his voice thin and cracking with a fresh, raw terror. The catalog number was a ghost, a complete fabrication from the old indexes. How did the museum in Lyon even acquire it? Monsignor Costello let out a low growl, a sound of pure, weary fury. Sloppiness, the chaos of revolution a century ago. A chest mislabeled, a forgotten manifest. It doesn't matter how. It matters that they read it. They had it for weeks. They translated the first line. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness. I held my breath, my own heart a frantic, silent drum. I could hear the Monsignor's heavy, labored breathing. The line about shaping the world with sound? Michel finally asked, his voice now barely a whisper. That's the one, Costello confirmed, his voice dropping. Word reached the Holy Office within a week. We dispatched the emissaries immediately. We acquired it, of course. No expense was spared. By the time their own scholars returned to study it again, it was gone. An empty drawer. We made sure it became what it is today, a ghost story, a foolish myth among academics. My blood ran cold. A scroll that could shape the world with sound. An empty drawer. This wasn't a historical debate. They were describing a cover-up, a theft orchestrated at the highest levels. But what if copies were made? Father Michel pressed, his panic rising. What if the language, the instructions were not fully contained? What if an echo remains? They were, the Monsignor said, and his voice became so low, so dangerous, I had to strain to hear it. The seal of silence holds. The original is where it belongs, locked in a lead case, shielded from light and sound. But this incident proves the true danger is not just in the past. The memory is still alive. The old magic, the Heka, it doesn't die, Father. It sleeps, and we must never, ever allow it to wake up. He put a heavy hand on the younger priest's shoulder, and I could imagine the gesture was more of a threat than a comfort. Your new assignment is to find any reference, any mention at all of this Lyon incident in academic correspondence from that period. Any letter, any footnote, any diary entry. And you will bring it to me. We will burn it. We will erase the echo, just as we erased the voice. Do you understand me? Father Michel could only manage a choked, terrified, "Yes, Monsignor." I waited in the suffocating darkness, my back pressed hard against the cold, damp stone, until their footsteps faded into the labyrinth. Heka. The word was alien, a venomous hiss in the sacred silence. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my very soul, that it was the name for the power I had seen in the Cardinal's book. They weren't just hiding history books. They were fighting a war. A secret, desperate war against a memory, a power, a voice they had tried to silence for 2,000 years. And I, a simple maid, a ghost in their machine, had just stumbled onto the battlefield. In a city built to display the glories of God, there are more than a dozen museums filled with priceless treasures. But the most valuable collection in Vatican City is one you will never find on any map. It has no name, no signs, and no tourists waiting in line. The few staff who even knew of its existence called it the deposito, the storeroom. But it was no storeroom. It was a prison. It was a concrete tomb for objects too dangerous to be displayed, too powerful to be destroyed, and too real to be forgotten. I only saw the inside of it once, for less than a minute, but it was enough to show me the true, terrifying heart of the Vatican's fear. It happened on a sweltering July afternoon. A curator, a frail, bird-like man named Father Anselm, who was in charge of the special collection, had suffered a mild heart attack in his workshop. In the quiet panic that followed, an assistant, his face slick with sweat, summoned me to help clean a spill of preservation fluid that had slicked the floor near the entrance. His workshop was adjacent to the vault itself, and in the chaos, the one rule that was never, ever broken was shattered. The door to the deposito, a massive slab of iron with no handle, only a series of complex, clockwork locks, stood ajar. For a single, heart-stopping moment, no one was watching me. The world seemed to slow down. My fear screamed at me to stay put, to clean the spill and be the invisible girl they expected. But the discovery in the Cardinal's study and the whispers in the archives had planted a seed of dangerous curiosity in me. I had to know. Driven by a terrible compulsion I couldn't suppress, I took 2 silent steps and peered inside. The air that flowed out was the first violation. It was cold, impossibly cold and dead, carrying a scent of dust, corroded metal, and a strange electric tang like the air after a lightning strike. This was not a grand gallery. It was a crypt. Dimly lit rooms branched off a central corridor, lined with shelves and crates that stretched into a waiting darkness. But the objects on those shelves were a pantheon of nightmares. There were no golden chalices or jewel-encrusted crosses. Instead, I saw rows of wooden statues of Egyptian gods with the heads of animals, their obsidian eyes seeming to drink the dim light and reflect nothing back. I saw amulets covered in hieroglyphs that seemed to faintly shimmer with their own internal energy. In one corner, I saw a collection of scrolls wrapped not in linen, but in black, leathery cloth, sealed with wax emblems depicting a serpent devouring its own tail. But it was the object in the center of the first room, sitting on a simple stone pedestal, that made my breath catch in my throat and the world tilt on its axis. It was a black tablet, smooth as polished glass, no bigger than a dinner plate. It was covered in intricate golden writing that was not quite hieroglyphs, but something far more complex. It wasn't the writing that was so terrifying. It was the stone itself. It didn't reflect the light. It consumed it. The space around it felt wrong, bent, as if the tablet were a hole in reality, a piece of the starless void given form. Get out! Get away from there! The voice was a strangled, desperate gasp. I stumbled back. It was Father Anselm, propped up by his frantic assistant, his face ashen, his eyes wild not with anger, but with a raw, abyssal terror. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "Her eyes have seen it," he whispered, a sound of pure horror. "She can't stay. She's been exposed." The assistant's face hardened. He grabbed my arm, his grip like a manacle, and roughly pulled me away from the doorway, slamming the iron door shut with a deafening boom. He spun me around, his face inches from mine. "You saw nothing," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "This place does not exist. You were never here. You will forget this, or we will help you forget." He released me, and I stumbled away, my mind reeling. But I couldn't forget. In that moment, the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle fell into place. The Vatican hadn't just collected these things as historical curiosities. They were containing them. They were acting as wardens for a power they didn't understand but deeply, mortally feared. The items in that vault were not relics of a dead faith. They were dormant weapons from a different kind of science, a different version of reality. From that day on, I was no longer just a maid who knew a secret. I was a witness to the truth they were willing to kill to protect. And in the Vatican, witnesses rarely stay silent for long. The Vatican has a special wing for its fading soldiers, a quiet, sun-bleached infirmary where the Church's most powerful and pious men are sent to meet their God. It is a place that smells of antiseptic and lilies, a sterile, holy silence where the memories of cardinals and monsignors are meant to be gently washed away before their final judgment. My duty there was simple: to offer comfort, to bring water, to sit with those whose minds had begun to wander. It was there, in that place of managed endings, that I heard a story that was never meant to have a beginning. His name was Father Thomas, an ancient Jesuit whose body was a frail, paper-thin vessel for a mind that had shattered into 1,000 pieces. For 50 years, he had been a missionary and an archivist, though the way he would sometimes hiss the word archivist made it sound like a curse. Most days he was lost in a fog, drifting between centuries, whispering in languages that were long dead: Aramaic, Coptic, and something else, something guttural and clicking that made the nurses cross themselves. But one stormy afternoon, as the sky over Rome turned a bruised purple and rain lashed against the tall windows, a strange clarity ignited in his clouded eyes. He shot forward, grabbing my wrist, his grip like a claw of iron. For a moment he wasn't seeing a maid. He was seeing a priest, and he was desperate for absolution. "Forgive me, Father, for what we brought back," he rasped, his voice a dry rustle of dead leaves. "We were so arrogant. The expedition of '64. We were ordered to find the lost library. Not Alexandria," he scoffed, a flicker of his old intellect returning. "The one before it. The one the desert was meant to swallow forever." His eyes were wide, fixed on a point beyond the walls, seeing a sun-bleached landscape from a lifetime ago. "We had maps older than our own faith, given to us by a pope who feared the old ways more than he feared God. We found the staircase, just as the forbidden texts described, buried beneath a temple that had been intentionally collapsed. The air, Mother of God, the air down there was wrong. It wasn't empty. It was full, heavy. And we found it. We found the scrolls. But we also found a voice." He squeezed my wrist so tightly I winced. "It wasn't a sound," he whispered frantically. "It was a resonance. It didn't use our ears. It spoke directly into our minds, into our souls. It showed us things, Father. The beginning. Not the one in Genesis. The real one. It showed us the gods were not gods, they were travelers from the stars. Told us the magic, the spells, the Heka. It wasn't prayer. It was a science. A technology of vibration, of memory, of creation." Tears, hot and real, streamed down his withered cheeks. "We were ordered to bring back its source. In the central chamber we found a stone, a heart. They called it in the texts. It was dark, but it pulsed with a faint, internal light. The moment we lifted it from its pedestal, the voice in our minds stopped. But the silence that fell, it was worse than the voice. It was a dead silence, an angry silence. He began to tremble violently, the storm outside rattling the window frame. 3 of our party were dead before we reached the Nile. Not from sickness, not from any wound. They just stopped, as if the life had been unplugged from them. The curse followed us back to Rome. We gave them their prize. We gave them the stone, and they locked it in the deposito. But we lied. We never told them the truth." He leaned in, his breath cold and smelling of death. "Taking the stone didn't just silence the voice in that chamber. It set it free. It's not buried in the sand anymore. It's loose. It's here in these very walls. And it has been listening all this time." He fell back against his pillows, the light in his eyes extinguished, the brief, terrible storm of memory passing as quickly as it had come. The words, however, did not pass. They hung in the air, more terrifying than any demon from a storybook. An expedition, a living voice, a stolen power that was now a prisoner within the same walls as its jailers. His confession wasn't just the rambling of a dying man. It was the key, confirmed everything. The great secret of the Vatican wasn't just something written on scrolls. It was alive, and it was angry. The old Jesuits' words were not a confession. They were a key that unlocked the final, horrifying door in my mind. Before, I had collected fragments of a truth I couldn't name. A cardinal's forbidden book, a whispered conversation in the archives, a glimpse into a vault of living nightmares. But now, the pieces clicked together into a single monstrous mosaic. The Vatican was not a church. It was a prison, a fortress built around a stolen, ancient power that was not dead, but merely sleeping and listening. My secret knowledge, once a source of quiet, internal fear, now felt like a death sentence branded on my soul. I was no longer just a maid. I was a liability, and the Vatican, I knew, was ruthlessly efficient at erasing its liabilities. The change was subtle at first, a shift in the atmosphere so slight that anyone else would have missed it. But after 12 years of surviving in the shadows, my senses were honed to the slightest vibration of danger. I saw it in the way a Swiss guard's eyes would follow me for a second too long as I crossed a courtyard. I felt it in the sudden, unannounced inspections of the staff quarters, where guards would move through our simple rooms, their eyes lingering on a diary, a letter from home. The questions from Signora Vettori became more pointed. "Have you been feeling well, Elena? You seem distracted. Were you assigned any duties near the archives recently?" Her tone was always deceptively casual, but her eyes were sharp, cold, and searching. They were watching me. I don't know if they knew exactly what I had pieced together, or if they just sensed that the obedient, invisible girl they had hired was gone, replaced by someone whose silence was no longer born of deference, but of terror. The net was tightening. The final, fatal mistake was mine. I was tasked with clearing out a small, disused cartography room, a forgotten corner where old, outdated maps were left to crumble into dust. As I was bundling them for disposal, a heavy vellum scroll slipped from my grasp and unrolled across the stone floor. It was a map of Egypt, but not the Egypt of today. It was ancient, hand-drawn, the Nile a thick, blue serpent coiling through a land of forgotten names. What made my blood freeze were the locations circled in angry red ink. They weren't cities or famous ruins. They were points in the empty desert, and beside each one was a single, chilling word written in Latin. Silter. Be silent. And then I saw it. In the margin, next to one of the red circles, was a faint pencil sketch, a hastily drawn symbol that I recognized with a jolt of pure, nauseating terror. It was the same abstract, star-like symbol the keeper of the vault, Father Luca, had drawn in ash on the floor of his room the night he died. The door to the room creaked open. It was one of the senior papal gendarmes, a man with a face like a closed fist. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me. Then his eyes dropped to the map on the floor, and then, slowly, back to me. His expression was utterly, terrifyingly blank. And in that blankness I saw my end. He knew. He knew that I had seen it, and he knew that I had made the connection. Without a word, he stepped back into the corridor and slowly pulled the heavy door shut. I didn't hear a key, just the soft, final click of the bolt sliding into place from the outside. Panic, cold and absolute, washed over me. This was it. The cage had snapped shut. They were not going to let me leave this room alive. I don't know where the strength came from, only that it was born of a terror so profound it became a kind of fuel. I looked around the room, a tomb of forgotten places. There was a small service window, high on the wall, caked with a century of grime. It was my only chance. I piled old chests and stacks of brittle maps, scrambled up, and threw my shoulder against the corroded iron latch. It groaned. Then, with a screech of tortured metal, it gave way. The window opened onto a narrow, hidden ledge overlooking a forgotten, weed-choked courtyard 3 stories down. That night, I didn't go back to my room. I didn't exist anymore. I became a true ghost, moving through the service passages, the hidden ways I had learned over 12 years of being invisible. I took nothing but the clothes on my back. I slipped out of Vatican City through a service gate used for laundry trucks, just another shadow in the pre-dawn gloom, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I have been running ever since. I change my name, I move cities, I trust no one. But I have never truly escaped. You can't outrun a memory like this. They tried to erase a history, a power, a truth about the world. But you cannot erase something that is still alive. The silence they guard is not the peace of God. It is the stillness of a hunter, waiting. And I know, with every fiber of my being, that someday it will break.